There is a very specific kind of arrogance that only belongs to people who have never had to work a single day in their entire lives. It is a loud, suffocating kind of confidence, built entirely on someone else's bank account, and it smells exactly like expensive perfume and unearned privilege. I was sitting in the cold, meticulously polished conference room of a high-end law firm downtown, watching that exact brand of arrogance walk through the double-glass doors. My stepchildren, Julian and Victoria, didn't just enter the room. They practically stormed it like they already owned the building. Julian was wearing a bespoke suit that probably cost more than a teacher's yearly salary, and Victoria was dripping in designer jewelry, her eyes hidden behind massive sunglasses, even though we were indoors. The funeral for their father, my late husband, Charles, had taken place exactly 4 days ago. 4 days. Most people would still be drowning in a fog of grief, staring at the walls, trying to process the absolute void left behind by a man who had lived such a massive, impactful life. But not Julian and Victoria. For them, the mourning period had officially concluded the exact second the casket was lowered into the ground. Now it was time for the real event. It was time to collect the prizes. Victoria didn't even bother to take off her sunglasses as she strutted over to the long mahogany table. She looked at me sitting there in my simple black dress, and a slow, incredibly nasty smirk spread across her perfectly manicured face. She didn't ask how I was holding up. She didn't offer a single word of comfort. Instead, she loudly pulled out a chair directly opposite me, slammed her luxury leather handbag onto the polished wood, and said that she was honestly surprised I had the nerve to show up today. Julian stood right behind her, crossing his arms, looking down at me like I was an unpleasant stain on the carpet. He chimed in immediately, his voice dripping with condescension, telling me that this meeting was strictly a family matter, a private discussion regarding the multi-million-dollar estate that his father had built with his own 2 hands. He told me, in no uncertain terms, that my temporary contract with their family had officially expired the moment his father's heart stopped beating. They genuinely believed that I was just a gold-digging interloper, a distraction their father had picked up late in life who was now standing between them and their rightful inheritance. They told me I had exactly 48 hours to pack my cheap suitcases and vacate the family estate before they had the locks changed and the security team escorted me off the premises. I didn't say a single word. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, and I didn't even blink. I just sat there, my hands folded neatly in my lap, maintaining absolute, freezing silence. If you have ever had to deal with incredibly toxic, greedy family members who try to push you around the second a loved one passes away, do me a huge favor and click that subscribe button right now, because the sheer level of poetic justice that is about to unfold in this room is something you absolutely need to see. Julian and Victoria took my silence as a sign of complete and total weakness. They exchanged a smug, knowing look, completely convinced that they had already won the psychological war. They thought I was paralyzed by fear, terrified of being thrown out onto the street with nothing to my name. But they didn't know anything about me, because they had never taken the time to actually look at me. To them, I was just the quiet woman who lived in their father's shadow. They had absolutely no idea that my silence wasn't fear. It was patience. It was the calm before an absolute legal storm that was about to completely wipe the smirks off their faces forever. You see, for the last 5 years of Charles's life, Julian and Victoria were completely invisible. They lived thousands of miles away in Europe, burning through the massive monthly allowances Charles faithfully sent them, ignoring his phone calls and only reaching out when their credit cards were maxed out or when they needed a down payment on another luxury penthouse. When Charles was diagnosed with an aggressive terminal illness 14 months ago, I was the one who answered the phone at 2 o'clock in the morning. I was the one who sat in the sterile hospital rooms holding his shaking hand through every single agonizing round of chemotherapy. I was the one who managed his medications, coordinated with the doctors, and held him while he cried in the dark, mourning the fact that his own biological children couldn't be bothered to fly back to see him, even when we told them the doctors said he only had a few months left. Victoria had claimed she was far too busy with a fashion show in Paris to fly home. Julian had said that traveling would interfere with his venture capital meetings in London. They couldn't spare 48 hours to say goodbye to the man who had given them everything. But the absolute second his pulse flattened, they were on the very first-class flight back to the city, ready to tear his legacy apart like a pair of starving vultures. Charles wasn't blind. He was deeply heartbroken, but he was a brilliant businessman who understood human nature perfectly. In those final, quiet months at home, while his children ignored his emails, Charles made a secret, definitive choice. He sat right at our kitchen table with his oldest, most trusted friend, a senior legal partner named Arthur, and they completely rewrote the future. The heavy glass door of the conference room clicked open again, and Arthur walked in, carrying a thick, leather-bound folder. He didn't look at Julian or Victoria. He walked straight to the head of the table, sat down, and offered me a small, incredibly warm, reassuring nod. The game was officially about to begin. Victoria leaned forward, tapping her long, diamond-encrusted nails impatiently against the mahogany table. She looked at Arthur and told him to get this circus moving because she had a flight to catch back to Europe in the evening. Then she pointed a sharp finger directly at me and told Arthur that before he opened a single document, he needed to order me to leave. She claimed that since I wasn't blood family, my presence was an insult to her father's memory and a complete waste of time. Julian joined in, his voice rising, saying that they wouldn't tolerate an outsider sitting in on a highly sensitive financial meeting regarding the family empire. He demanded that security be called to escort me to the lobby. Arthur slowly stopped organizing his papers. He took off his reading glasses, placed them deliberately on the table, and looked up at Julian and Victoria. For a man who had practiced law for nearly 40 years, his expression was entirely unreadable, but I could see the faint, dangerous glimmer of a smile hiding in the corners of his eyes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't get defensive. He just looked at Julian and said that under the strict legal guidelines of this state, and according to the explicit written instructions left behind by their father, every single individual currently sitting in this room was required to be present for the formal reading of the estate plan. He told them that if they had an issue with my presence, they were more than welcome to stand up, walk out those doors, and forfeit their participation entirely. Julian's face turned a deep, angry shade of red. He opened his mouth to shout, but Victoria grabbed his arm, pulling him back down into his seat. She glared at me, her eyes burning with pure hatred, whispering that it didn't matter anyway. She whispered that a few minutes of uncomfortable silence was a small price to pay to watch me get completely wiped out. They truly believed that the law was on their side simply because of their DNA. They had spent their entire lives treating the world like a vending machine that owed them a prize, and they were completely incapable of imagining a scenario where they didn't get exactly what they wanted. They settled back into their chairs, smirked at me once more, and signaled for Arthur to begin. They were ready to claim their kingdom, completely oblivious to the fact that the crown had already been placed on someone else's head.